You just ordered sushi without a second thought. Raw tuna, straight from the case to your plate. No fire, no pan, nothing. But say the words raw chicken out loud, and something in your stomach turns over immediately. That's strange because chicken and tuna are both just meat, just protein, just muscle. So why does one feel completely normal and the other feels like a trip to the hospital? Your gut isn't really reacting to raw versus cooked. It's reacting to something much older than that and much stranger. This isn't some modern food trend either. Archaeological sites in Japan show evidence of raw seafood being eaten thousands of years ago, long before anyone had a word for sushi. Peru's ceviche tradition, using citrus instead of heat, developed among coastal communities who had no reliable way to preserve a catch. Raw fish might be one of the oldest ways humans have ever eaten protein. Start with the thing people actually worry about. Anisakis is a small parasitic worm that lives in the muscle of fish like salmon, cod, and mackerel. Swallow one alive, and it can burrow into your stomach lining, causing a condition called anisakiasis. Cramping, vomiting, sometimes an emergency room visit to have it physically removed. It sounds terrifying, and yet sushi-grade fish almost never gives anyone this problem. The reason is almost embarrassingly simple. The FDA requires fish meant to be eaten raw to be frozen first, either around a week at standard freezer temperature or roughly 15 hours at a much colder commercial one. Freezing kills the parasite outright. A multi-million-dollar global sushi industry is quietly protected by a box that makes things cold. Not every fish carries equal risk either. Freshwater species tend to host a wider range of parasites than saltwater ones, which is part of why traditional sushi leans so heavily on ocean fish rather than river fish in the first place. Now compare that to what actually makes raw meat dangerous, and the story changes completely. It's barely about worms at all. It's about bacteria, and specifically, which bacteria happen to be good at living inside a body like yours. Raw beef and raw poultry can carry E. coli, salmonella, and campylobacter, and all three evolved inside the gut of a warm-blooded mammal or bird. Your gut is also warm. A cow, a chicken, and a human are all running at roughly the same internal climate, which means bacteria built for one of us tend to be frighteningly well equipped for the rest of us too. The CDC estimates Campylobacter alone causes well over 1 million illnesses a year in the United States, most tied back to undercooked poultry, which goes a long way toward explaining why raw chicken triggers a near-universal recoil that raw tuna simply never does. Fish don't share that disadvantage. A cod spends its entire life at a water temperature that would give a human hypothermia. Drop a cold-adapted fish pathogen into a 98.6-degree human intestine, and it's not built for that environment. It never had to be. Disease ecologists have an actual name for this pattern: the phylogenetic distance effect. The idea that a pathogen jumps hosts far more easily between closely related species than distant ones. A pig shares a striking amount of biology with a human, which is exactly why raw pork earned such a brutal reputation. Trichinella spiralis, the parasite behind trichinosis, moved through pork for centuries, before modern farming and inspection standards mostly eliminated it from commercial meat. Older cultures didn't need a microscope to know something was wrong with raw pork. They just watched what happened to the people who ate it, and in the United States alone, trichinosis infections numbered in the thousands per year through the early 20th century before stricter farming and food safety rules pushed that number down to a small handful of cases annually. Push that same logic to its extreme and you land on the single most dangerous meat a person can eat raw. Primates, bushmeat from chimpanzees and gorillas, has been directly linked to some of the deadliest cross-species jumps ever recorded. Researchers, including the virologist Beatrice Hahn, trace the origin of HIV to a chimpanzee virus that crossed into humans through exactly this kind of contact, likely decades before anyone noticed anything was wrong. When the animal on the plate shares nearly all of your own DNA, there's almost no biological gap left for a pathogen to cross, which makes it about as close to a worst-case scenario as this whole pattern can produce. Now, to be fair, this isn't some universal human instinct, and it's worth being honest about that. Plenty of cultures eat raw beef without hesitation. Steak tartare in France, kibbeh nayi in Lebanon, yukoe in Korea, carpaccio in Italy. None of these are fringe foods. They're centuries-old dishes served in serious restaurants. So the aversion to raw meat isn't hardwired the same way disgust at rotten fruit seems to be. It's learned, regional, and shaped heavily by whichever food safety disaster a given culture happened to survive. There's an even sharper twist up in the Arctic. Inuit communities have long eaten raw and fermented meat from seals, whales, and caribou. Foods like muktuk and quaq, despite these being mammals far more closely related to humans than any fish. On paper, that should be riskier than raw beef. But the animals involved live their entire lives in near-freezing conditions, which keeps their bacterial load radically different from anything found in a warm feedlot. Distance, it turns out, isn't only about the family tree. It's also about the temperature an organism grew up in, and that's exactly why the fish story and the Arctic story end up pointing at the same underlying rule from two completely different directions. The psychologist Paul Rozin, who's spent much of his career studying disgust, has argued that food aversions work less like fixed instincts and more like inherited warnings. A culture gets burned by something once, badly enough, and the caution sticks around for generations, long after the actual danger has mostly disappeared. American squeamishness about raw chicken traces back to a real and fairly recent history of salmonella outbreaks. Japanese comfort with raw fish traces back to an equally real history of coastal communities eating it safely for thousands of years, quietly refining exactly which cuts, which seasons, and which methods kept people alive. So the fish isn't actually safer than the meat in some absolute universal sense. It's safer for specific, traceable reasons. A cold-adapted organism that struggles in a warm human body. A single freezing step that wipes out the one parasite that matters. A few 100 million years of evolutionary distance that keeps most fish pathogens from ever getting comfortable inside us. Raw beef and raw pork carry a different kind of risk because the organisms living in them come from animals biologically close enough to us that jumping the gap is almost trivial. Warm blood. Recognizing warm blood. Which means the next time you're deciding what to eat raw, your gut isn't just being squeamish. It's tracking something real, and it's been keeping score a lot longer than you have. Not a rule about fish versus meat, a rule about distance. If this changed how you think about your next order of sashimi, stick around because there's a lot more science like this ahead. And subscribe, because the next one might rearrange something else you assumed was just instinct.